Snow lashed against his face when Dario Fontaine found the woman tied to a dead oak at the edge of a cliff. "Please, don't untie me," she rasped, tears freezing on her pale round cheeks. Ignoring her desperate plea, the Baltimore port boss swung his blade through the thick rope, and her body instantly slid toward the yawning chasm below. He caught her wrist in the split second before she fell, and his blood ran cold as he realized that rope was the only thing keeping her from dropping off the ice-covered ledge. Dario was a 34-year-old man carved from steel and shadow. His dark hair was streaked with early silver at the temples, and his gray eyes were as cold as a frozen lake. A faint scar ran along his left jaw, reminding him every day of the night his father was gunned down. 5 years atop a criminal empire had taught him to trust no one, but it had never taught him how to ignore a human being dying in a blizzard. This woman was nothing like the people he was used to. Her full figure was trembling beneath a thin coat that couldn't hope to fight off the sub-zero cold. Her soft, round face was the kind everyone was quick to dismiss as harmless, and her calloused hands belonged not to a killer, but to someone who spent long hours bent over columns of numbers. When she collapsed into his arms, a sealed plastic pouch pressed tight against her chest tore loose and fell into the snow. Inside was a USB drive and a stack of documents. Through the ice-crusted plastic, the only thing he caught a fleeting glimpse of was the faint outline of the Fontaine family crest. There was no time to read the blurry text or account numbers beneath the lashing snow, but the mere sight of his family emblem left his blood running cold. This woman wasn't some random victim. She was carrying something tied directly to his bloodline. Who had tied her here? Why had they used his name? And by cutting that rope, had he just saved a life, or set loose the very thing that would destroy everything he had left? If you love stories about redemption, and about the people everyone underestimates turning out to be the strongest of all, hit that like button to support us. Don't forget to share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel today so you never miss another chapter of this journey. The rope had snapped clean apart, and the girl's weight dragged them both toward the edge of the ravine. Dario dug his heels into the ice, the tendons in his neck standing out as he poured every ounce of strength he had into the arm gripping her wrist. Centimeter by centimeter, he pulled back, dragging her limp body away from the snow-covered ledge until they both collapsed onto the hard ground, his breath bursting out in white clouds that dissolved into the wind. The girl lay motionless against his chest, her round face pressed to his leather coat, her bluish lips no longer trembling, and it was that stillness that made his heart tighten in a strange, sudden beat. He placed 2 fingers against her throat and searched. There was a pulse, faint as a butterfly about to fall from a branch, but it was still there. She wasn't dead, but if she remained exposed in this storm for another 10 minutes, the cold would finish what the edge of that ravine hadn't had time to do. Dario looked down at the plastic packet lying in the snow a few steps away, the headlights from the car parked on the narrow trail casting a dim streak of light across the documents fluttering in the wind, and his family crest stamped boldly on them like a silent accusation. In that instant, the man who had been forged by 5 years of rule spoke first inside him, cold and practical. This woman was holding something that could destroy everything he had built. Someone had used his name for transactions he'd never known about, and she was the only thread leading to the truth. But she was also the thread that could tighten around his throat. The logic of a dawn told him that the safest choice was to let the storm erase every trace, to let this girl disappear with her secret beneath the thick snow, and no one in this world would ever be able to trace his hand in it. For 5 years, he had survived on calculations as cold as ice, had learned how to strangle every other voice inside himself in order to stay alive. But when he looked down at her face, something stubborn in him refused that calculation. This wasn't an assassin sent to end him, not a pawn in some enemy's game. This was a human being whom someone had tied to a dead tree in the loneliest stretch of wilderness, left to the cold and to death, staged so that anyone who happened to pass by and tried to save her would become her killer. The calculated cruelty of that game made the slow anger inside his chest flare to life. His father had taught him only one thing before falling under a hail of bullets, that a man could lose everything: land, money, even his name. But the moment he turned his back on someone weak who was begging to live, he had lost the one thing that could never be bought back. Dario wasn't a saint. His hands had been stained with things he would never speak of. But he wasn't the kind of man who would let a human being freeze to death simply because it was convenient. The decision didn't come to him through a long struggle. It came clean and sharp, like the blade that had just cut the rope. He tore off his heavy leather coat and wrapped it around her cooling body. The scent of leather and pinewood caught in the fabric, closing around her like a shell. Then he bent down, picked up the plastic packet, brushed the snow from the pages, and tucked it inside his own coat, because no matter what happened next, he needed to know who was behind all of this. He slipped one arm beneath her back, the other behind her knees, and lifted her from the snow with a gentleness that surprised even him. She was lighter than he had imagined. Or perhaps anger and resolve had made that weight mean nothing at all. The wind still howled through the pines, flinging handfuls of snow into his face as he strode toward the car. But this time, he didn't lower his head to avoid it. He laid her in the back seat as carefully as if he were setting down something breakable, then got behind the wheel, his gray eyes sweeping one last time over the whitewashed darkness behind him, where the dead oak still stood alone with the severed length of rope dangling and swaying in the wind like a question that had not yet been answered. The car's engine roared as Dario pressed the gas, the wheels spinning on the frozen snow before finally catching the road and lunging forward, the headlights tearing a pale yellow tunnel through the thick darkness. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles blanched white, his narrowed eyes fixed on the narrow trail that kept vanishing beneath each fresh fall of snow. He knew this road by heart. Every bend, every steep rise, every stretch where the rock face pressed close to the edge. But tonight the storm had turned it into something foreign. Every familiar landmark, swallowed by the wild white confusion, and he had to drive more by memory than by sight. Behind him, on the back seat, the girl still lay silent beneath his leather coat, and each time the car jolted over a pothole hidden under the snow, he glanced quickly into the rearview mirror to make sure she hadn't slipped from the seat. Heat from the vents began spreading through the cabin, slowly melting the ice clinging to the windshield, and he turned the dial to its highest setting, forcing the warm air toward the back where she lay. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she had come from. He only knew that every minute passing by was another minute in which the cold was gnawing at the life inside her, and the lodge was still at least 20 minutes away in normal driving conditions, while tonight nothing was normal at all. As he took a sharp curve that his gaze accidentally swept up to the rearview mirror, and something made him go still. Far behind him, blurred beyond the thick curtain of snow, was a pair of headlights, two murky yellow points of light, trembling in and out of sight through the storm, clear one moment and dim the next, as though they too were struggling with the road. Dario felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. This trail led into the national forest north of the city, a place where, in the middle of a January blizzard at night, there shouldn't have been another soul passing through. No honest reason for anyone to drive this deep into the woods at this hour. He eased his foot slightly off the gas, his eyes never leaving the mirror, watching those lights with the caution of a man who had survived 5 years by suspecting every moving thing in the dark. It might have been only a forest ranger on a late patrol. It might have been a reckless poacher. It might have been nothing more than a meaningless coincidence. His exhausted mind was swelling into a threat. But his instinct, the instinct that had saved his life more than once, whispered something else. He let the car slow a little more, then accelerated again, and the lights behind him seemed to match his rhythm, keeping the same distance like a shadow. His heart beat slowly and heavily. If these were the men of whoever had tied the girl to that tree, if they had come back to make sure their victim was dead, then his appearance and his decision to save her had ruined their entire game, and now they were following him to correct the mistake. Dario reached down, felt for the gun tucked at his waistband, and let the familiar cold weight of it settle under his palm, a silent reassurance. He took another curve, this part of the road hidden behind a large outcrop of stone, and for a few brief seconds his car was completely shielded from the view behind him. He seized that chance, snapped off the headlights, let the car glide into a small turnoff tucked beneath a stand of pines heavy with snow, then sat motionless in the dark, holding his breath, his eyes fixed through the ice-glazed glass on the trail behind him. 1 minute passed, then 2, stretching out like forever, and then those headlights appeared, sweeping past the turnoff without slowing, their glow dragging a faint streak across the trunks of the pines, before rushing onward and vanishing into the snow ahead, leaving the road to sink back into white silence. Dario sat there a while longer without moving, listening to his own heartbeat and the howl of the wind, wondering whether he had just escaped a real shadow or only a ghost built by his own fear. Then he let out a soft breath, switched the lights back on, and quietly guided the car onto the road again, this time driving faster, more decisively, with the clear and troubling sense that the race against time had just become far more dangerous than he had imagined. The lodge appeared in the woods like a solid block of darkness tucked against the hillside, and Dario shoved the car door open and plunged into the curtain of snow, carrying the girl in his arms across the yard, before driving his shoulder into the heavy wooden door. Inside, the lingering warmth from the smoldering fireplace received them, and he laid her down on the thick rug before the hearth, then quickly threw several pine logs onto the red coals and blew until the flames rose and began licking around the dry grain of the wood. Firelight washed the room in gold and laid a false warmth across her face, but when he touched her cheek, her skin was still cold as stone, and he knew the real enemy now wasn't the man driving through the storm, but the cold that had already seeped deep into her bones. He had watched strong men fall to hypothermia before. He had learned how to wrestle a body back from that white death, and now those old lessons returned in every movement. He removed his leather coat, soaked with snow, from around her body, then carefully stripped away the damp outer layers that were stealing what little warmth she had left, wrapping her in the thick wool blankets he snatched from the nearby bed. He paid attention to nothing except warming her, placing warm stones wrapped in cloth against both sides of her neck and beneath her arms, where the blood vessels ran closest to the surface, rubbing his calloused hands over her arms to coax heat back into her. It was then, as he took her hand to warm it, that he went still. These hands didn't tell the story her kind, round face seemed to suggest. The tips of her fingers bore thin, hard calluses in exactly the places where someone who had held a pen and typed at a keyboard for many years would develop them. A small rough patch beside the middle finger of her right hand, where a pen had pressed through tens of thousands of hours. He turned her palm upward and examined it beneath the firelight. These weren't the hands of an assassin. There were no thick calluses at the base of the fingers from gripping a gun, no tangled white scars belonging to someone accustomed to living by blades and fists. These were the hands of a person who spent long hours beside numbers, someone who worked with papers and screens, someone whose weapon was the mind, not steel. His first instinct, the instinct that had screamed this was a trap, that this girl had been sent to finish him, suddenly cracked beneath the weight of one small piece of evidence that couldn't be denied. A professional assassin didn't have hands like these. A pawn in an enemy's game didn't carry on her body the marks of long nights bent over calculations. Dario frowned, tucked her hand back beneath the blankets, and a new line of thought began to coil through his mind, colder and sharper than the storm outside. If she wasn't an assassin, then who was she? If she hadn't been sent to kill him, then why had she been carrying documents stamped with his family crest, account numbers he himself had never seen? A bookkeeper, a woman who lived by numbers, had somehow wandered straight into the center of a plot, cruel enough to tie a person to a dead tree in the depths of the forest. He looked down at her face, now a little less pale beneath the firelight, her round cheeks slowly taking on a fragile hint of pink as warmth threaded its way back into her blood, and a strange feeling rose inside him, half curiosity, half something close to remorse, because he had almost allowed his cold reason to abandon a human being he had completely misunderstood. He pulled a wooden chair closer to the fireplace and sat beside her, his elbows braced on his knees, his gray eyes never leaving that unconscious face. Outside, the wind still lashed against the ice-crusted windows, and somewhere in the whitewashed night, those strange headlights might still be searching. But in this moment, inside the lodge drowned in the crackle of fire, Dario had only one question filling his mind, a question only the woman lying before the hearth could answer, and he would wait, even if he had to wait until morning, to hear her speak the truth. When the girl's breathing had steadied and color had returned to her cheeks, Dario finally drew the plastic packet from inside his coat, set it on the wooden table beneath the oil lamp, and began turning through each page under the sickly yellow light. What he saw made the cold outside feel meaningless compared to the chill rising inside his chest. The first page was a dense ledger crowded with numbers, line after line of transactions, each one a massive sum of money moved back and forth between accounts under the names of companies he had never heard of, faceless names created only to hide where the real money was flowing. But what made his hand tremble wasn't the numbers. It was the familiar crest of the Fontaine family, the eagle spreading its wings around an anchor, printed in the corner of every page like a seal of approval, as if he himself had signed his name to every filthy transaction. He flipped faster, his eyes sweeping across the following pages, and then he began to see names he recognized. The names of two men who worked under him at the port, men he had once trusted to run the warehouses, now appeared beside figures he couldn't explain. Something was happening inside the very heart of his organization. a vast underground current moving beneath his own name. And he had been completely blind to it. Dario sat up straight, his jaw clenched tight, and pulled his phone from his pocket. Out here in the woods, the signal had only one weak, flickering bar left, but it was enough. He dialed Gareth, the man who had stood beside him since the day he took over his father's empire, the only man on earth to whom he still dared entrust a piece of his faith, a former accountant for the family who now oversaw all of its books, both the legal ones and the ones that must never see daylight. The phone rang 3 long times through a veil of static before Gareth's sleep-thickened voice came on the line, asking what had happened for him to call at this hour. Dario didn't circle around it. He read aloud the name of a company from the page, then an account number, and told Gareth to trace what it was, who owned it, and where the money moving through it led. A long silence followed on the other end, broken only by the clatter of typing mingled with static, and Dario rose, walked to the window, and stared out into the white darkness while he waited, his fingers tapping restlessly against the wooden frame. When Gareth spoke again, his voice was fully awake, and there was something in the tone of it that made Dario's entire body tense. Gareth said the company name belonged to a chain of dozens of shell companies, all linked through overlapping layers of ownership, and all leading back to one place. Every one of them was registered under the control of the Fontaine family, under Dario's own name, with authorization signatures he had never written. The money that had passed through those companies over the past 2 years reached into the hundreds of millions, a filthy river of cash laundered clean and then fed back into the legitimate economy. And on every document, every record, every trail the authorities could follow, the man standing at the head of that entire machine was Dario Fontaine. He stood motionless by the window, the phone pressed hard to his ear, and for one moment he forgot to breathe. For 2 full years, someone had turned him into the face of a crime he hadn't even known existed, had used his name, his reputation, and the empire his father had built with blood as a shield for their dirty money. And if the authorities ever traced these transactions, the first and only person who would pay the price, the man who would spend the rest of his life behind bars, would be him. Gareth kept asking where Dario was, how he had gotten this information. But Dario only stood there, his eyes fixed on his own faint reflection in the ice-coated window, then slowly turned his head toward the fireplace, where the woman lay unconscious beneath the wool blankets. The girl he had found beside the dead tree, the girl he had almost left to the cold, had somehow been holding the very map that led to the person who had quietly placed his entire life on a chessboard. He quietly told Gareth to keep everything secret and not say a word to anyone, then ended the call and stood there for a long time in the silence, listening to his heart pound, knowing that the answer to every question tormenting him was hidden behind the closed eyes of the strange woman lying by the fire. The first sensation that returned to Renata was warmth, a warmth so foreign and suspicious that it awakened her instinct for danger before she even managed to open her eyes. In the hazy space between sleep and consciousness, memory rushed back like a stream of ice, the cold slicing into her skin, the rope tightening around her chest, the dead tree behind her and the ravine waiting in front of her, the cold face of the man who had tied her there and walked away with a faint smile, the words she had told herself, that she would die in that place and no one would ever know. And yet, she was still breathing. Her eyes flew open, and her first reaction wasn't relief but terror, because she didn't recognize this place. She was lying on a thick rug before a burning fireplace, her body wrapped in heavy wool blankets that smelled of wood and smoke, and the dull ache in her wrists and along both sides of her ribs reminded her that everything that had just happened had been real. She lay still, forcing her breathing to remain even as though she were still asleep, while her brown eyes barely opened and swept quickly around the room, gathering every detail. A wooden lodge, walls paneled in dark planks, a hunting rifle mounted on a rack in the distance, a heavy closed door on the left, 2 ice-covered windows through which she could see nothing but a dense white darkness. And then she saw him, the man sitting at the wooden table beneath the oil lamp, his back partly turned to her, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the wall, leaning over something spread out on the tabletop. Renata's heart tightened. This wasn't the man who had tied her up. This was someone else, larger, calmer, and it was that very calm radiating from him that frightened her more than anything. She had lived long enough in the world of dirty numbers to recognize the shape of real power, the kind of power that didn't need to shout, didn't need to show itself off, but merely sat there in silence and made the whole room hold its breath. Then her gaze fell to the table in front of him, where her documents lay exposed beneath the lamp, the plastic packet torn open, and all the blood in her body seemed to freeze again. He had seen them. He had read them. The thing she had nearly traded her life to protect, the secret she had buried, fled with, and allowed herself to be tied to a tree in the deep woods to safeguard, was now in the hands of a strange man who looked exactly like the sort of person she had been running from. A cold thought pierced through her mind. If he was one of them, if he was the man those pages accused, then the fact that she was still alive wasn't salvation, but a delay. One last chance for her to reveal the rest before she was silenced forever. Renata didn't allow herself to panic, though her heart was beating as if it wanted to break through her chest. She was used to being underestimated, used to being seen as the harmless, chubby girl who only knew how to bend over ledgers. And she knew that sometimes that very contempt was the only weapon she had. She let her eyes drift half-closed again, suppressing a shudder when the movement sent pain stabbing through the wound along her ribs. Then slowly, centimeter by centimeter, she moved one hand out from beneath the blanket, feeling for leverage, measuring the distance to the heavy door on the left. 2 steps, perhaps 3, if her legs would still obey her. She didn't know whether she had enough strength to stand, much less run, but lying still and waiting wasn't how Renata Voss had survived this long. She had endured too much alone, saved herself too many times, to now surrender her fate to the questionable kindness of a stranger. She drew in a slow, hidden breath, tightened the muscles that felt ready to collapse, and prepared for the sudden lunge she knew very well might be the last mistake of her life. But at that exact moment, without turning his head, without taking his eyes off the papers on the table, the man spoke, his voice low and calm enough to send a chill through her, saying that she didn't need to run, that outside was a below-freezing blizzard, and she wouldn't survive more than 10 minutes, and that if he had wanted her dead, he wouldn't have gone through the trouble of dragging her away from the edge of that ravine. Renata froze halfway through the movement, the desperate spring in her muscles dying before it could begin, and she slowly let herself sink back onto the rug, understanding that he had seen through her from the start, that her act of pretending to sleep hadn't fooled anyone. Dario turned in his chair, facing her directly for the first time, and under the oil lamp, his gray eyes swept over her face, not with the gaze of a predator, but with that of a man trying to solve an equation. He picked up one page, turned it so the crest of the eagle embracing the anchor faced her, then asked in a voice that was calm yet sharp as a blade who she was and why she had these things on her. That crest struck Renata like a stab to the center of her chest. She looked at it, then looked at him, and every piece in her mind instantly fell into a terrifying picture. The Fontaine crest. The powerful man sitting before her in this wooden lodge deep in the forest was Fontaine himself. The very name printed on every filthy document she had risked her life to expose. The very man standing at the head of the machine that had swallowed her life whole. A soft laugh, bitter and trembling, broke from her throat. She had run everywhere, had nearly died beside that tree, only for fate to throw her at last into the den of the monster she had been hunting. She said, her voice hoarse but every word hardened by rage, that she knew exactly who he was, that he didn't need to pretend curiosity anymore, that he could end this right now the way he had always intended to. Dario's eyes narrowed, and a flicker of astonishment crossed his face, so swift that Renata would have missed it if she hadn't been watching him closely. He asked her again, slowly, who she thought he was. She spat out that name as if forcing something bitter from her mouth. Fontaine, the money launderer, the man who had used power to buy off the very people who were supposed to protect justice, the man whose name stood boldly at the top of every transaction that had destroyed her life and driven her to be tied to a tree to wait for death. The more she spoke, the faster her voice became, her fury drowning out the pain in her ribs, and she braced her hands against the floor and pushed herself fully upright, forcing herself to meet his stare without retreating, because if this was the last day of her life, then at least she would look straight into the face of the man who had caused it all. But Dario's reaction wasn't what she had expected. He didn't mock her, didn't deny it with polished ease, and didn't draw a gun. He simply sat there in silence for a long while, then set the page down on the table with a movement so slow it felt almost strange. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something deep and heavy that she hadn't expected. He said that yes, he bore the Fontaine name. Yes, the name on those pages was his, but he swore on his dead father's grave that he had never signed any of those transactions, had never known those shell companies existed until exactly 1 hour ago, when he called the only person he still trusted, and discovered that for 2 years, someone had turned him into the face of a crime he had known absolutely nothing about. Renata stared at him, her chest rising and falling, and part of her wanted to scream that it was the most shameless lie she had ever heard, that a man like him would say anything to save himself. But there was something in his eyes, a suppressed shock, a slow burning anger aimed not at her but at some invisible enemy, that made the accusation catch in her throat. And for the first time since she had awakened, a thin thread of doubt slipped into the solid wall of her hatred, a small but aching question, that if she had mistaken the man before her, then where was the real enemy hiding? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind striking the window, and in that stillness, Renata felt the wall of hatred she had built around herself begin to tremble before the frightening honesty in his eyes. She still didn't trust him, couldn't trust him right away, but she understood that if he had wanted her dead, she would already be dead, and that the only person who understood those pages better than he did, the only person who could tell him what they truly meant, was her. So she decided to speak, partly because she was exhausted, partly because she had carried this secret alone for so long that it was eating her from the inside out. She said her name was Renata Voss, that she was a forensic accountant, and that her work was to follow dirty money through layer after layer of shell companies, to read the real story hidden behind numbers people had deliberately twisted to conceal the truth. She told him she had worked for a respected auditing firm in Baltimore, a place into which she had poured nearly all her youth, working harder than anyone else to prove she deserved to be there, so no one could look at her and brush her aside as a chubby girl who was only good at petty paperwork. Her voice sank lower when she reached the day everything collapsed, the day she was assigned to audit the files of a major client, and began to realize that something didn't add up, money moving in circles for no sensible reason, companies with no employees and no offices moving hundreds of millions, and the deeper she dug, the more she realized she was standing at the mouth of a bottomless pit. She did what she believed was right. She took her findings to the boss she respected most, the man who had guided her from her earliest days, the man she saw almost like a father, and she believed he would help her bring it all into the light. At that point, Renata's voice faltered. She lowered her head, her calloused fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket, and when she spoke again, every word sounded as if it had been wrung out of an unhealed wound. She said that boss had smiled, had thanked her for her dedication, had told her to leave everything to him, and 3 days later, she was fired for a fabricated reason. Her accounts were locked, and her professional reputation was smeared with rumors that she had committed fraud, that she was mentally unstable. She understood too late that the person she had trusted most was the one who had betrayed her, that he was in bed with the very force she had just exposed, and that now she hadn't only lost her job, she had become a danger that needed to be erased. She said that from that day on, her life turned into a flight from place to place. She didn't dare return to her apartment, didn't dare use her old phone, and survived on a little savings and a courage that was slowly running out. She had copied all the evidence before her account was locked, because the instinct of someone trained to follow the truth told her that it was the only thing keeping her alive, her shield, and also her death sentence. Renata lifted her head and looked at Dario, her brown eyes brimming with tears, though not one fell, because she had run out of tears long ago, and she said in a hoarse voice that she didn't know which of these names belonged to the real mastermind. She only knew that the Fontaine name stood at the top of everything, and that was why, when she woke inside this lodge and saw his crest, she had been certain she had fallen into the hands of death. She stopped, her breath trembling, then asked him the question they both knew would change everything, that if he truly wasn't the man behind those pages, did he dare join her in finding the person who had placed both their names on the same chessboard? Dario didn't answer her question right away. Instead, he stood, walked to the fireplace, and stared into the flames for a long while, as if weighing how much trust he should place in someone he had suspected of being an assassin only a few hours earlier. Then he turned back and said plainly that if she had risked her life to keep those pages, then she was smart enough to know that keeping them alone was no different from holding a bomb with a ticking clock, and he asked what she had done with the rest, because he knew a good forensic accountant would never put all her eggs in one basket. That question made Renata lift her head slightly, and for the first time since waking, something almost like respect flickered through her eyes, because he had seen straight into the very thing others had always underestimated in her. She stayed silent for one beat, reassessing the man before her, then decided to place on the table the card she had kept hidden through all those days on the run. She said the file in the plastic packet he was holding was only one half, and not even the more important half, that in truth, it was the bait copy she had deliberately allowed to be exposed. She explained that before everything collapsed completely, during the final days when she was still allowed to sit in her office, she had quietly copied all the evidence and divided it into two parts. The core portion, the part containing the original transaction records and the thread that connected directly to the mastermind, she had encrypted and sent to the only person she believed was still clean inside that rotten system, a federal agent named Hollis Park, who had handled a financial case in which she had testified many years earlier. The only person who had ever treated her statement with respect, instead of a dismissive stare. She had sent Park that half of the evidence along with a message saying that if she disappeared, this would be the reason. As for the portion in this plastic packet, the part they had found when they searched her and tied her to the tree, it was only a set of copies she had arranged carefully to look as though it was everything she had, enough to make them believe that killing her would end the matter, enough to buy more time for the real portion already safe in the hands of the authorities. When Renata reached that point, she gave a faint smile, a tired smile lit by the cold courage of someone who had calculated every move even while standing before death, and she said they had underestimated her, just as everyone had always underestimated her, and that contempt was their greatest mistake. Dario stood silently and looked at her, and something in the way he looked at her had changed completely. The woman sitting before the fireplace, with the gentle features the whole world had been so quick to dismiss, had just shown him that she had played a more intricate game than any hard-seasoned man in his organization, that even while tied up and waiting to die, she had still been moving the pieces from the dark. He realized that she wasn't a helpless victim who needed saving, but an opponent, a possible ally so sharp she was dangerous, and that his own survival was now bound tightly to her mind. He asked whether Park could be trusted, whether the other half of the evidence was safe, and Renata nodded, saying that as long as she was alive to confirm it and fit the two halves together, the complete evidence would carry weight before the law, and that was why they needed her dead, and also why she still had value alive. Dario slowly nodded, and in his mind a vague plan began to take shape. But first he needed to know one thing, the most important thing. He looked straight into her eyes and asked whether, among all the names she had traced, there was any name that didn't bear the Fontaine name, but still appeared again and again like a shadow standing behind everything. Dario's question made Renata frown, and instead of answering, she reached toward the stack of documents on the table, signaling that she needed to look at them again. He hesitated for a moment, then slid the papers toward her, and Renata began turning through the pages with the speed and focus of someone returning to her own territory, her brown eyes moving swiftly across the numbers, her calloused fingers tracing the lines of transactions as if they were a language only she could read. For those few minutes, she almost forgot the pain in her ribs, forgot even the man standing there watching her, completely sinking into the maze of numbers she had spent her entire career learning how to decode. Then she stopped. Her finger froze in the middle of a page, and her whole body seemed to harden. She read one line again and again, then flipped back several pages to compare it, and when she lifted her eyes to Dario, her expression had changed completely. The fragile spark of doubt that had just begun to glow inside her was extinguished, replaced by the icy vigilance of an animal that had suddenly realized it was standing too close to a predator. She asked him, her voice sharpened and guarded now, who Adrian Fontaine was. The question hung in the air like a blade. She said that name appeared here, not once but many times, tied to authorization orders buried in the deepest layer of the chain of shell companies, in the exact position where only the person truly controlling the money flow could have signed. She said that if he insisted he was innocent, then who was this person bearing the Fontaine name? And how could he know nothing about the existence of a transaction carrying his own family's name? She drew back from him a little, pulling the blanket around her shoulders like a thin piece of armor, and in her voice now was all the suspicion of someone who had nearly allowed herself to trust, only to suddenly realize she might be making the very same mistake that had driven her to that dead tree. She said plainly that perhaps he had staged this entire act of surprise. Perhaps the phone call earlier had only been a performance. Perhaps he was keeping her alive only to find out where she had hidden the rest of the evidence, and that the name Adrian Fontaine was proof that his family was far more deeply involved than he was willing to admit. Renata spoke faster and faster, fear and fury twisting together, because the thought that she had been deceived again, that her trust had once more been used by a powerful man, was almost more than she could bear. But when she looked at Dario's face, waiting for a lying reaction, for some smooth denial. She saw the opposite. He stood frozen, his face paling in the firelight. His gray eyes, usually cold as ice, widened as they stared at the page she was pointing to, and the name Adrian Fontaine seemed to strike him harder than anything she had just said. His hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles turning white, and a muscle along his scarred jaw twitched again and again. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft popping of the fire. And Renata, though still braced with caution, couldn't help recognizing that his reaction wasn't that of a man who had been exposed, but of someone who had just seen a ghost from a past he thought he had buried long ago. She tightened her grip on the edge of the blanket, her heart pounding, not knowing whether to trust the cold logic of the numbers accusing him, or the pain that had looked far too real as it passed across this man's face. And in that struggle, she could only ask one more question, softly and trembling, what that name meant to him. Dario slowly sat down in the chair across from her, as if his legs no longer had the strength to bear the weight of that name. And when he spoke, his voice was low and rough, distant, as though it were echoing back from some place buried deep in the past. He said Adrian Fontaine was his younger sister. He said she had died 7 years ago, gone in an accident he had never believed was truly an accident, even now, and that seeing his sister's name lying on these filthy pages, turned into a link in a money laundering machine, was crueler than anything he had ever imagined. Renata went still, the caution inside her wavering before a naked grief that couldn't possibly be performed if it were false. Dario closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again and began to speak, each scattered piece in his mind finally fitting together into a picture that horrified even him. He spoke of a man named Silas Beaumont, a name that, to the whole city of Baltimore, stood as a symbol of respectability, a wealthy businessman, chairman of a major charitable foundation, a man who was often photographed shaking hands with politicians, a man no one in high society would ever dare associate with the word crime. But to Dario, Beaumont was something else. Beaumont had once been his father's business partner back when both men were young, the man who had stood beside the Fontaine family during the years of building, the man his father had trusted almost absolutely, and it was that very trust, Dario now understood, that might have been the beginning of every tragedy. He told her that after his father was gunned down on that fateful night years ago, Beaumont had been the first to come and offer condolences, the one who had offered to help him shoulder the responsibilities he had still been too young to carry, the one who had smoothly planted his own people in key positions at the port under the name of help. For all those years, Dario had thought Beaumont was a respected uncle, an ally, never realizing that, step by step, that man had been quietly hollowing out his empire from the inside, building an entire network of shell companies operating under the Fontaine name, using his family's reputation and power as a shield for his dirty money. And Adrian's name, his sister's name, had probably been dragged into it from the very beginning, the identity of a dead girl turned into a ghost signature on transactions no one could trace, because the dead couldn't rise and deny it. Dario clenched both hands, and now there was a cold, terrifying anger in his voice, as he said that if these papers were real, then Beaumont wasn't only laundering money under his name, he was also setting a trap, so that one day, when he needed a scapegoat, all he would have to do was pull back the curtain and let the world see that the man behind every crime was Dario Fontaine, while Beaumont himself walked away at ease in a tailored suit with the smile of a philanthropist. Renata listened, and piece by piece, the story of her life began locking into his with chilling precision. The major client she had been assigned to audit, the company from which she had traced the first thread, she now remembered, had ties to one of the charitable organizations bearing Beaumont's name. The boss who had betrayed her, the man who had smiled while taking the evidence from her and then turned around to destroy her, must have done it because he was part of Beaumont's network. Both of them, from two completely different sides of the city, a port boss and a discarded accountant, had been manipulated by the same invisible hand, had been driven to the edge by the same enemy, and now fate, with all its bitter irony, had thrown them into the same wooden lodge in the middle of a storm. Renata looked at Dario, and for the first time, the wall between them truly collapsed, not because she had stopped being cautious, but because she realized that the man who had ruined her life was also the man who had stolen this man's name, his family, and his peace. She said softly, her voice trembling but steady. That meant they weren't each other's enemies, that they were the only two people in the world who knew the truth, and that if they didn't expose Beaumont together, They would both die with their names blackened. Outside, the storm was still howling, burying the narrow trail beneath snow that grew thicker by the hour, imprisoning them both inside the wooden lodge like two people the world had forgotten. And in the heavy silence that followed Renata's words, Dario rose, threw more wood into the fireplace, watched the flames surge upward, then began to speak about the night that had split his life in two. He said that year he had just turned 29, still too young, and still carrying too much faith in the idea that one day his family could wash the past clean and step into the light. His father, a hard man who nevertheless carried a code inside him and lived and died by it, had arranged to meet someone that night to discuss slowly withdrawing from the darkest operations, to turn the port toward legitimate business. Dario said, his voice sinking lower, that he had been sitting in the car with his father, right beside him, when the figures stepped out from the dark. He didn't recount the details of what happened afterward. He only said that in those few brief seconds his world had shattered, that he had held his father when it was already too late, and that the scar running along his jaw was the only mark left on his body from that night. A scar he saw every morning when he looked in the mirror, a silent reminder that he had survived and his father hadn't. He raised a hand and touched that scar unconsciously, then lowered it and said the cruelest thing wasn't losing his father, but the fact that afterward he never found the one who had given the order, never knew whose hand had pulled the strings, and had to live for years with an unanswered question gnawing at him from the inside. Renata sat still and listened, and she realized that now, through her pages, perhaps that answer had finally appeared, that the invisible hand he had been searching for through 7 long years might very well be the hand of the man who had come earliest to offer condolences, had kindly offered to help him carry the burden, and that truth was so heavy she didn't have the heart to say it aloud, so she simply let it hang between them. Dario went on, saying that after that night, he became someone else. He learned not to trust anyone, because he had seen how trust could kill, had seen how his father's faith in the wrong people could become a knife in the back. He said he took over the empire with an iron hand, built walls around himself, and pushed away anyone who tried to come close. Because to him, every relationship was a weakness, and every person he cared about was a hostage his enemies could use against him. For the past 5 years, he had lived like a ghost at the top of his own power, surrounded by hundreds of obedient men, but not one true friend, wealthy enough to buy almost anything except the one thing he longed for most, to trust someone once without fearing that trust would kill him. He said this lodge was where he came whenever he wanted to escape the empire that was strangling him, the only place where he could take off the mask and simply be human, and how bitterly ironic it was that here, on the very night he had come to run from everything, he had found her. He turned to look at Renata, firelight dancing in his gray eyes, which no longer seemed quite so icy, and said in a voice so quiet it was almost lost beneath the wind, that it had been a very long time since he had told these things to anyone, and that he didn't understand why he was telling them to a stranger he had known for only a few hours. Renata didn't answer with hollow comfort. She only said softly that perhaps because the same darkness had touched them both, they could see each other in a way people who had never lost anything would never understand. And in that moment, inside the wooden lodge filled with the crackle of fire and the roar of the storm, 2 broken people from 2 different worlds felt, for the first time, that they were no longer entirely alone. That moment of closeness didn't last long, because Dario's practical mind quickly returned to the danger waiting ahead, and he said that when the storm cleared, he would take her to a safe place, a discreet house he owned outside the city, where no one would find her, and he would handle the rest with Beaumont on his own. He said it in the voice of a man used to giving orders, a man who believed that protecting someone meant putting them away beyond the reach of danger, and he assumed she would receive it with relief. But Renata sat up straight, ignoring the pain in her ribs, and said one firm no that made him stop short. She said she wouldn't hide anywhere, that she hadn't sacrificed her entire career, her honor, and nearly her life just to end up curled inside a house waiting for another man to decide her fate. Dario frowned and said he understood Beaumont better than she did, that she didn't know how dangerous an enemy she was facing, that keeping her away was the only way for her to live. And that very sentence touched something that had been smoldering inside Renata her entire life. She burst out, her voice trembling with emotion but every word cold and sharp, that all her life people had looked at her and decided for her what she could and couldn't do. She said people saw her round face and full body and assumed she was harmless, useless, just a sweet girl, sitting in some office corner handling petty paperwork, that her boss had judged her exactly that way when he believed betraying her would bring no consequences, that Beaumont's men had judged her exactly that way when they thought tying her to a tree would be the end of it. She said the whole world had made the mistake of underestimating her too many times, and she wouldn't let the man who had just said he saw who she really was become the next person to lock her away because he thought she wasn't strong enough. Dario was silent, and Renata went on, this time her voice softer but no less determined, saying that she was the one who had traced this network when an entire system had failed to detect it. She was the one who had split the evidence in half and sent one part away while being hunted. She was the one who had created the bait copy to deceive the people trying to kill her. She said no one in this world understood those numbers better than she did. No one else could join the two halves of the evidence and turn them into something strong enough to charge Beaumont under the law except her. And if he truly wanted to bring down their common enemy, then he needed her not as an object to be hidden away, but as an equal standing beside him in this fight. Dario looked at her for a long time, and something inside him shifted. All his life, he had measured human strength by the things he could see, by muscle, by weapons, by ruthlessness, and he was used to surrounding himself with people who knew how to create fear. But the woman sitting before him, without a single weapon, her body still weakened by injury, possessed a kind of strength that his entire empire couldn't buy, a mind so sharp it couldn't be shaken, and a quiet courage that had withstood a whole powerful force without breaking. He realized that all evening he had made the very mistake she had just condemned, had looked at her and wanted to protect her as if she were something fragile, when she wasn't fragile at all. He slowly nodded and said that he had been wrong, that he wouldn't hide her away anywhere, and that if she wanted to stand in this fight, then they would fight together, as equals. In Renata's eyes, there flickered something she hadn't felt from another person in a very long time. Respect. And that, more than the warmth of the fireplace, warmed a cold corner of her heart she had thought had frozen forever. By dawn of the second day, the storm had finally exhausted itself. The howling wind that had raged for dozens of hours suddenly fell silent, leaving behind a white stillness stretching all the way to the horizon, the first sunlight shining through the ice-coated window and making the entire forest glitter as though it had been plated in silver. Dario stood by the window, looking out at the narrow trail now buried beneath snow, his mind already mapping the route down the mountain, while Renata sat beside the fireplace, trying to move her arm to ease the stiffness, both of them carrying the fragile feeling that they had won back a little time. But that peace shattered in a single instant. Renata's phone, the backup phone she had kept hidden, and whose number only one person in the world knew, suddenly vibrated on the table, the screen flashing in the dim room. She looked at the name on the display and her face went pale, because it was Aunt May's number, the aunt who had raised her after her mother died, the only family she had left in this world, the gentle woman who lived quietly in a small town several hours from Baltimore and had nothing at all to do with the dark world her niece had accidentally fallen into. Renata answered, pressed the phone to her ear, and called her aunt's name in a trembling voice. But what answered her wasn't the familiar warmth of Aunt May's voice. It was a man's voice, calm and courteous enough to chill the blood, a voice polished like velvet with cold steel hidden underneath. The man introduced himself as Silas Beaumont, and the mere sound of him saying that name so leisurely made both Renata and Dario freeze. Beaumont said he was very pleased to speak with Miss Voss, the woman he had believed was resting somewhere deep in the woods, and that he had to admit she was far more persistent than he had expected. He explained, in the unhurried tone of a man who held every card, that his people had returned to the forest on the night of the storm to confirm she was dead, but instead they had found only a severed rope and tracks showing that someone had cut her down, that through the heavy snow they had followed a pair of headlights racing down the mountain but lost them at the bend, and that all it took was tracing that car, tracing the only man who owned a lodge in that national forest, for him to understand everything. He gave a soft laugh and said it was quite an interesting coincidence that the person who saved her was Dario Fontaine, the son he had been watching for a very long time. Then his voice changed, turning unmistakably cold, and he came straight to the point. He said he was keeping Aunt May somewhere safe, that she was still well and would remain well as long as Renata behaved sensibly, and that he didn't want to harm an innocent older woman, he only wanted back what belonged to him. He laid out his terms clearly, as cold as a contract. 48 hours. Renata had to bring him all the evidence, both the part she had hidden and the part she had sent away, and hand it to him in exchange for her aunt's safety. And if she called the police, if she tried any clever little trick, he would know, because he always knew. The line cut off sharply, leaving behind a long, cold beep that echoed through the room, which suddenly felt airless. Renata lowered the phone, both hands shaking violently, and she sat there in silence as if all her strength had been drained from her, because of all the blows fate had struck against her. This was the cruelest. They hadn't been able to kill her, so now they had aimed at the only weakness she had left, the only person in the world who loved her unconditionally, the kind woman who had never harmed anyone, and now had to pay the price simply because she had a niece who dared to stand against evil. Dario stepped closer and placed one hand on her shoulder, and when Renata looked up at him, her eyes no longer held the cold resilience of the hours before, but the naked fear of someone about to lose the last piece of family she had, and she whispered, her voice breaking, that she couldn't let Aunt May die in her place, that she would hand everything over if that was the only way. But Dario, his eyes hardening into steel, gave a slight shake of his head and said that handing over the evidence wouldn't save anyone, because once Beaumont had what he wanted, he wouldn't leave a single witness alive, and that if they wanted to save Aunt May, they would have to be smarter than him, not surrender to him. Dario began pacing the cramped room, his shadow stretching long across the wooden wall with each step, and when he spoke, his voice had returned to the cold tone of a don, calculating a purge. He said he knew where Beaumont would keep the hostage, that the man had only a few places discreet enough and secure enough for something like this, that he had men, weapons, and loyal people ready to follow him anywhere, and that the fastest, surest way to end this was to gather his men, storm the holding place, get Aunt May out, and wipe out Beaumont and every one of his soldiers before he had time to react. He said it with the frightening calm of a man accustomed to solving every problem with force, a man who, for years, had known only one language when facing an enemy. But Renata shot to her feet, swayed for a moment because of her wound, then steadied herself and said no, one firm word cutting straight across his calculations. She said that if he brought a whole armed crew crashing into the place where Aunt May was being held, the first person to pay the price wouldn't be Beaumont but Aunt May, that a man as cruel and careful as him had surely instructed the guards what their first move should be if anything went wrong, and that she wouldn't gamble the life of the only family she had left on a bloody gunfight no one could truly control. Dario stopped walking, turned to look at her, and said this was his world, not hers, that he had survived in it his entire life, and he knew men like Beaumont understood only one thing, greater force, that softness and clever little calculations meant nothing in front of a man who would stop at nothing. They stood facing each other across the firelight, and for the first time since the suspicion between them had dissolved, a new wall rose up. Not a wall of mistrust, but of two worldviews colliding. Renata looked straight into his eyes and said she understood his world, but she refused to step into it. That if they solved this with blood, if they answered Beaumont's evil with the very violence he had sown, then even if they won, they would have already lost. She said that all her life she had chosen to follow the truth through numbers instead of fists, had believed there was a way to bring wicked men into the light without turning herself into another version of them, and that she wouldn't throw away that belief even when it was the hardest thing to hold on to. Then her voice softened, and she said something that made Dario fall silent. She said she knew he had lived in darkness so long he had forgotten there was another road, that he had grown used to every problem being solved by making someone disappear. But that very way of life had taken his father from him, his sister from him, and his peace from him. She said that if he chose that road again, he would remain forever a prisoner of the very world that had destroyed him, and that she didn't want to watch the man who had given her the first true respect she had felt in years drag himself deeper into that darkness with his own hands. She said, almost pleading now, that there was a way to bring Beaumont down and still save Aunt May, a way to use the trap he was setting to trap him in return, a way to use the weapon she knew best, truth in numbers, to make him condemn himself with his own hands. Dario stood motionless for a long time, the anger and killing instinct inside him wrestling with what she had just said, and Renata could see the battle taking place behind those gray eyes, the battle between the man darkness had created and the man he might once have become. At last, in a hoarse voice, he asked her what the plan was, and in that question Renata heard something more precious than agreement, because for the first time in his life, this powerful man was willing to place his trust in another person's mind instead of the gun at his waist. Renata pulled the chair closer to the table, sat down, and for the first time since waking, she no longer looked like a victim fighting to survive, but like an expert stepping into her own territory. She told Dario to bring her the laptop he kept in the cabinet, and when her calloused fingers settled on the keyboard, Her whole being seemed to change, her eyes sharpening, the cool confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing radiating from her. She explained, speaking as she typed, that Beaumont wanted evidence, so they would give him evidence, but it would be evidence of her own making. She said she would create a set of accounting records that looked flawless, down to the smallest detail, complete with transaction logs, money flow charts, and the kinds of things a man like Beaumont would surely have to open and examine himself to make certain she wasn't deceiving him, because a man who had built an entire empire on caution would never trust a file without checking it with his own eyes, and that would be the very mistake she would make him commit. She explained that in forensic accounting, there was a technique used to track people who stole documents, embedding something invisible inside a file, a small piece of code linked to a remote server, so that the instant the file was opened, it would quietly send out a signal reporting the exact time and the location of the device opening it. She said she would place something like that inside the false file, an invisible beacon, so that when Beaumont opened the file to inspect it inside his lair, that very action would automatically transmit his coordinates, turning his caution into the trap that snapped shut over his own head. Dario listened, and a faint smile, the first smile he had shown throughout the entire story, briefly touched the corner of his mouth, because he realized she had just turned the enemy's strongest weapon, his suspicion, into his fatal weakness. But Renata wasn't finished. She said that a location signal alone wasn't enough, because knowing where he was would mean nothing if no one with the authority to act could move on it, and that was when the other half of the evidence would come into play. She picked up the backup phone and said it was time to contact Hollis Park, the federal agent to whom she had entrusted the core portion of the evidence earlier. She explained that coordinates alone wouldn't convince anyone, but if Park already held the original transaction records proving the money laundering network, then all they needed was the real-time location, where Beaumont appeared with the material evidence, along with her direct testimony, and it would be enough to obtain a lawful action order. Enough so that when the authorities moved in, they wouldn't only save Aunt May, they would catch Beaumont at the scene with undeniable evidence in his hands. She said that way he wouldn't die easily under a bullet and become just another mystery, but would have to stand before a court, would have to let the entire world that had once praised him watch him be stripped bare, and that was the rightful punishment for a man who had hidden behind a respectable mask for so many years. Dario watched her type the final lines of code, watched the way she arranged every detail of the plan with the precision of someone who had spent her whole life seeing order hidden inside chaos, and he realized that if it had been him, he would have settled this with blood and lost everything in the process. He said quietly that he would do it her way, and that he would handle getting Aunt May out of danger at the exact moment the authorities moved in, so not one hair on her head would be harmed. When Renata looked up and met his eyes, she saw that he no longer held the gaze of a Don looking down on someone weaker, but the gaze of a man placing his life and fate in another person's hands, a trust he had admitted he hadn't given anyone in 5 years. And she understood that among everything being wagered that night, the fragile trust now beginning between them was the most precious and breakable thing of all. The place Beaumont chose for the exchange was an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the old port, a gray concrete block crouched beside rows of rust-stained containers, where the sound of waves striking the dock mingled with the wind whistling through broken panes of glass to create a cold music of ruin. Renata walked in alone through the massive iron door at the appointed hour, her damp palm clamped around the USB containing the bait file she had spent the entire night building, while somewhere in the darkness of the container yard behind her, Dario had silently moved in from another route, his eyes locked on the spot where 2 men were escorting a small figure. Renata's heart tightened when she recognized Aunt May, her gentle aunt standing there between the 2 guards, her silver hair disheveled, fear etched across her face, yet her head still lifted with stubborn dignity. And when their eyes met, Renata had to summon all her strength to keep her knees from giving way, to hold on to the calm the plan demanded. Beaumont stepped out of the darkness, and for the first time Renata saw with her own eyes the man who had pulled the strings of so many tragedies in her life, an older man in an expensive wool coat, his graying hair carefully combed, his face wearing the composed smile of someone accustomed to being respected, and it was precisely that gentle, respectable appearance that made him more frightening than any brute. He greeted her in a courteous voice, praised her courage for daring to come alone, then held out his hand and demanded what belonged to him. Renata didn't hurry. She said she needed to see Aunt May released first, and Beaumont only gave a soft laugh, replying that everything would happen in order, that he needed to inspect the goods before returning the person, because a man in his position never paid for something he hadn't seen. Exactly as Renata had predicted. She stepped forward, placed the USB in his palm, and backed away, trying to keep her breathing steady, while her heart beat like a drum. Beaumont signaled for one of his men to bring over a laptop, and he plugged the USB in himself, his cold, sharp eyes moving across the screen as he opened each file with the precision of a man who trusted no one. Renata held her breath. Her entire plan hung on this moment, on the assumption that his suspicion would force him to open those files with his own hands. And when his cursor clicked on the first document, she knew that deep in the darkness, an invisible signal had just silently flown out, carrying the coordinates of this warehouse to a screen somewhere where Hollis Park was waiting. But Beaumont was an old fox. He skimmed through several pages, then suddenly stopped, lifted his eyes to Renata with a narrowed look of suspicion, and asked in a voice that was still mild, but now edged with coldness, why a smart girl like her would hand everything over so obediently. The air inside the warehouse thickened. One of his men began walking toward the rows of containers, as if he had scented something wrong in the dark, moving closer and closer to the place where Dario was hidden, and Renata felt her whole plan threatening to shatter. She had to draw his attention back, and she did the only thing she could. She spoke, her voice trembling but trying to sound defiant, saying she was handing it over because she had no other choice, because he was holding the only person she still loved, and that if he thought she had the nerve to play tricks, then he had overestimated someone who only knew how to sit with numbers. Those words, that self-belittlement she had known too well after a lifetime of being dismissed, became a weapon in her hands this time, and it worked. Beaumont considered her for a moment, then let out a soft laugh, the caution in his face loosening, and at the exact moment his man was only a few steps from Dario's hiding place, a new sound tore through the night from the far side of the port, the urgent wail of sirens from a line of vehicles racing toward them, red and blue lights sweeping wildly across the warehouse walls, and in that instant of chaos, as every eye turned toward the noise, Dario burst from the darkness and crossed the space toward Aunt May as swiftly as a shadow. Everything happened in a blink amid the chaos. The wail of sirens had thrown Beaumont's men into confusion, and they turned their heads wildly toward the approaching streams of light. At the exact moment the two guards holding Aunt May lost focus, Dario was already beside her, wrapping one arm protectively around the older woman and pulling her out of their reach, retreating quickly into the safe darkness between two rows of containers. Aunt May staggered, but Dario held her firmly and whispered into her ear that he was with Renata, that she was safe now, and only when she heard her niece's name did the woman stop struggling and cling to his arm. The henchman who had been approaching Dario's hiding place froze halfway there, torn between chasing after them and saving himself, but the loudspeaker, ordering everyone to drop their weapons, answered for him, and like a pack of animals realizing the trap had snapped shut, Beaumont's men began thinking first of their own lives. Hollis Park had arrived, leading a team of federal agents into the warehouse from every side. And the agent, a woman with a resolute gaze whom Renata had only ever heard by voice, now strode through the wash of light with her command signal raised high, shouting that the entire area was surrounded. The invisible signal Renata had hidden inside the bait file had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had quietly flown out the instant Beaumont opened the file with his own hands, leading the authorities straight to these coordinates, and when combined with the core half of the evidence she had sent to Park during her days on the run, it had all been enough to secure an unshakable lawful action order. Beaumont stood frozen in the middle of the warehouse, the laptop still glowing in the hands of one of his men, and for the first time, the respectable composure on his face cracked. He understood, too late, that the suspicion he had always taken pride in, the habit of having to inspect everything himself, was exactly what had just betrayed him. He whipped around to look at Renata, and in his eyes was the astonishment of a man who had spent his whole life underestimating others, only now realizing he had been defeated by the very person he had believed was the most harmless of all, an accountant he had once thought could simply be tied to a tree and forgotten. Renata looked straight at him without turning away, and in that moment she didn't say a single word, because her silence, the straightness of her back as she stood inside the circle of justice, said everything for her. Beaumont's men dropped their weapons one by one and knelt on the cold concrete with their hands behind their heads, and a few of them, as they were marched past him, even threw bitter looks at their former boss, because they understood that his collapse had dragged them all down with him. The shadow empire Beaumont had spent so many years building, the network held together by fear and greed, fell apart in only a few short minutes once the man at its center was no longer an untouchable force, but merely an older man being handcuffed amid the wreckage of his own making. Hollis Park stepped in front of Beaumont and read him the rights of a man under arrest, and when the cuffs tightened around his wrists, Renata finally allowed herself to breathe out, her whole body trembling as the pressure of those terrifying months fell from her shoulders all at once. She ran toward the darkness between the two rows of containers, where Dario emerged supporting Aunt May. And when her gentle aunt stumbled forward and threw her arms around her, Renata held her tightly, burying her face in the silver hair of the only family she had left in the world. And for the first time after so many months of holding herself together, the tears she had thought had dried up long ago rolled down her round cheeks. Dario stepped back one pace and silently watched the aunt and niece cling to each other, and across his usually steel-cold face passed an emotion he himself had nearly forgotten, a tenderness slipping through the frost, because he realized that the plan had not succeeded because of guns or loyal men, but because of the mind and courage of a woman the whole world, including him at the beginning, had once made the mistake of underestimating. In the weeks after that fateful night at the port, the entire city of Baltimore was shaken by the collapse of one of its most respected men. Silas Beaumont, the charitable foundation chairman who had always smiled in photographs while shaking hands with politicians, was arrested inside his own magnificent office, where the walls were covered with awards and pictures recording a life that had seemed spotless. When federal agents led him down the red-carpeted corridor under the stunned eyes of those who had once bowed before his power, the respectable mask he had worn for decades finally fell away, revealing beneath it nothing more than a man who had built his entire fortune on lies, fear, and the blood of innocent people. The evidence Renata had worked so hard to gather, once fitted together into a complete picture, became something no expensive lawyer could refute, and every thread in his network was pulled into the light one by one, dragging along the people who had helped him, including the former boss who had once smiled as he betrayed her. The Fontaine name, after years of being turned by Beaumont into a shield for crime, was finally cleansed when the records clearly proved that Dario had never signed any of those filthy transactions, that he too had been a victim whose identity had been stolen, and that even the name of his late sister had been used with unspeakable cruelty. But what surprised many people most was what Dario did afterward. Instead of quietly returning to the familiar darkness, he chose another road, the road his father had dreamed of on the last night of his life. He began the work of bringing the port's entire operation into the light, cutting away each dark branch, turning the empire that had once been held together by fear into a transparent business. And though he knew the road would be long and full of thorns, for the first time in years he walked it without feeling the weight of a cursed name pressing down on his shoulders. As for Renata, she didn't become a hero celebrated across the newspapers, because that had never been what she was looking for. She simply returned quietly to Aunt May, cared for the woman who had raised her, and little by little rebuilt her life from the broken pieces. Her professional honor was restored. The rumors that had once stained her name disappeared, and many people in the field now spoke of her with the respect reserved for someone who had stood alone against an entire force and won, not with strength, but with intelligence and courage. The most beautiful thing left behind after everything wasn't a flowery confession of love or a fairy tale ending, but a quiet bond between two people who had once been shattered. Dario and Renata still kept in touch, sometimes sharing a simple dinner together, and in those moments, people saw a Dawn who had once been cold as ice, now learning how to listen, and a woman whom the whole world had once underestimated, now knowing that her worth had never depended on anyone else's judging eyes. They didn't hurry to name the feeling beginning to bloom between them. They simply cherished the fact that at last they had found someone who saw them exactly as they truly were, and sometimes that was already a gift more precious than anything else. If this story leaves anything in your heart, perhaps it is the reminder that we must never judge a person by appearance, because true strength often hides quietly inside those we are quickest to underestimate, that courage isn't always loud. And sometimes it is simply the silent perseverance of someone who dares to stand up for what is right, even when the whole world turns away. And that real justice doesn't come from revenge in the dark, but from the truth brought into the light. Every person carries a dignity. No one has the right to trample, and sometimes the noblest thing we can do is look at another person with respect and understanding, instead of rushing to judge. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video, so we can listen together to many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. How do you feel about this story? Which character left the deepest emotions in your heart? And which moment moved you most profoundly? Please leave a few lines in the comments so we can hear the sincere feelings from the bottom of your heart. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen. We wish you abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Goodbye for now, and see you again in the next videos.